The tragic death of George Floyd at the hands of police has reignited a human rights movement led by young adults, including right here in Hingham. But what does Black Lives Matter mean? And what's it got to do with our town? And what about All Lives Matter? And Blue Lives Matter? Local citizens sit down and share their views on these questions and others in a series called Community Conversations.
Hi, I'm Rohini Gadraj. I'm a Hingham resident and my family has lived here for almost 20 years.
Hi, my name is Chief Glenn Olson. I'm the chief of the Hingham Police Department. I've been with the police department for 40 years. We moved as a family to Hingham in 1960. So for the basic part of my life, I've been a Hingham resident. And I'm glad to be able to be serving and meeting today with this group to discuss these important issues.
Hi, my name is Desmond Sullivan. I've been a Scituate resident my entire life, and I'm a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Scituate.
So I actually had a conversation with Chief Olson about organizing another caravan protest. And in the midst of that, we started talking about how to confront people who didn't agree with us. Because we don't want these discussions about Black Lives Matter to become a vacuum with just people who agree with us. We want to make it more accessible to people who might not understand the movement or might not seek out this kind of information.
During our discussions, we felt that there was a lot of confusion about what the Black Lives Movement meant, and sometimes people would ask us about it, and I really needed to educate myself on it as well. And I think providing environments where people can openly talk about it and work out their differences is something we need to do as a society. And I think as police chief, that's part of my job, to be involved in this type of conversation, to see what the norms of society are and what the traditions are and how we're changing as a society.
Well, first, before I get started talking about it, it's important to note that we're not an official chapter of Black Lives Matter, but we are in contact with Black Lives Matter Cambridge and Boston, the NAACP, and the ACLU, so we try to work to those standards. I began protesting on the Scituate Greenbush Rotary, and from there, that gained a lot of steam and momentum and attention. So we figured that the next step would be affiliating ourselves with the Black Lives Matter movement and organizing larger protests and eventually policy changes that can be used in Scituate and in other towns, hopefully. And the reason we felt it was essential to start this and to start these conversations is because while racism is not necessarily overt in these towns, in these homogenous towns, in these wealthy towns, it still does exist. And the second point to that would be that a lot of these children who are living in these towns, like Hingham, are the children of lawyers, of doctors, of very affluent people and elites in our society. And if these children understand these issues, come to understand what it means to be an ally, to be anti-racist, to stand up to white supremacy, and to stand up to the oppression that exists in our society, we will build a better and more just society. So that's why we began with it. The essential thing to remember is that Black lives have not mattered in the United States for a very long time, for 400 years, essentially. And the reason that we say Black Lives Matter is because we are trying to represent the oppressed people of this land. And yes, of course, all lives matter. That goes without saying. But Black lives right now are not being treated as they should be in the United States. And that's why we say Black Lives Matter as opposed to All Lives Matter.
I felt compelled to do this because I had my first really aggressive forms of racism towards me when I was a child here at the elementary school. And I think my family and I, being one of the only families of color, we never really felt that we could speak up or that we were part of the community. There was this subtle kind of like detachment or otherment. And I think that, I just felt like right now it's so important to show our support for such an important movement, and being compelled to kind of almost see who else in the town will support this, to see if people are actually willing to put, publicly display that they think that Black Lives Matter and that people of color matter, and that hopefully maybe they can, as you said, it's very important to teach your kids about racism. And if people of color have to experience it, you can definitely teach your kids. So I think it's one of those things where I just wanted to see the community really come together and kind of show me that the tide is turning in a way that they will be willing to teach their kids, and they will be willing to talk about racism more.
That's a tough question to sort of answer, and I as a police department, we always want the support of the community. And as a police department, our officers are not concerned about the uprise in officers being killed over as time progresses. But I think they're two separate issues, and we really can't confuse them. The result of officers being killed in the line of duty, are different issues in society. It could be violence, it could be, a lot of those things that are happening. But it's different than the Black Lives Matters movement. And I don't think, in my mind, the two really aren't connected. And I do agree with the fact that we have oppression and we have built-in racism that we probably, as a society, I shouldn't say probably, as a society, we do need to work on. And that's why I'm here, because I need to make sure that our officers and police departments all across the nation understand this. And, I'll spend 40 years trying to do the right things and treat people fairly. And, sometimes it hurts when I hear some of these things, and it appalls me sometimes when I see when police do things that are really bad. Like the George Floyd thing was just violated every single rule and regulation and just common sense that officers should have. And I think it's important that when those times come that we do stand up and we meet with groups and we try to make changes. And I just think that, if we all sit down and have these discussions, we don't have to agree on everything, but the more we discuss things, the more it is. And I've had discussions before about racism is a really difficult thing to talk about because people get nervous and, people are not sure how to have a conversation. They're afraid of offending people. And, I've always found it uncomfortable, and I need to work at that because it shouldn't be that way. And it shouldn't be, the two sides need to communicate better and walk away as friends, I guess is what I'm saying,
When it comes to Blue Lives Matter, the flag, I think it's, the flag or the sign or the shirts or whatever, I think it's incredibly insensitive. I think that the reaction, regardless of what that flag stands for people, it now is a symbol of division. It now is a symbol of the other side. And that very well may not be what it's intended for and what police officers take it as. But unfortunately, that's what we're seeing at white supremacist rallies. That's what we saw at Charlottesville, are these Blue Lives Matter flags. And to react to the death of George Floyd, to the murder of George Floyd, and to the murder of all of these other people at the hands of police officers, to have a flag, to have a symbol showing support for that at this time, I think is incredibly insensitive. And I think is not the right stance that police departments should be taking. And I think that right now, police departments should denounce the use of that symbol, However, making it a safe space, perhaps adopting a different form of respecting the officers who have been killed or died in the line of duty. That's my thinking on that.
I completely agree with you, Desmond. I think it's extremely insensitive to be kind of just full on display of those flags everywhere, and kind of this rhetoric of, oh, we support our police department, oh, we support Blue Lives Matter, all of a sudden came up as the Black Lives Matter movement started. So why weren't people saying this before? It's just kind of, it's so much of a defense mechanism now to protect that comfort zone that people had, that no, our police department's good, or the police department is good, and it doesn't really need changes. It just kind of creates this barrier of people who think that they're pro-police and people who they think that are anti-police. And that's not what the Black Lives Matter movement is about. It's not anti-police. It's just changing the system of oppression that has been there for so long. And another thing is, blue lives aren't really a thing, right? Because that's a uniform that you put on voluntarily. That's a job that you signed up for. People don't choose to be black. People don't choose to be of color. That's something that we have to live with and that we have to deal with on a daily basis. You can take your uniform off and then all of a sudden now you're not a blue life. You can go home and live in your safety of, if you're a white officer, in that whiteness. People of color, especially black people, do not have that choice. So this division of blue lives versus black lives is like absolutely ridiculous to me. When we moved here, I think I had just turned 6. I was very young, and it's something that you feel as well, even as a child. There's looks that people give you. There's kind of like, staying away from certain people. And when I was in elementary school, I was talking to a friend on the bus. I wasn't very close to her, but we were talking about what we would do if we were president. And, silly child things that I was saying, ice cream for everyone, no homework, whatever. And she said something similar. And then she came back the next day and she said, oh, my friend told me something. And I said, oh, about what we talked about? She said, yeah. My friend said if she was president, she would kill all the people of color or put them on an island so they could be away from us. And at that time, I was probably 6 or 7. That was my first real understanding of, oh, people don't like me because of how I look. And I didn't understand, and I went home and I told my parents, and they were obviously horrified because that's not that child's idea. She didn't come up with that on her own. That was clearly influenced. And I didn't want to make a big deal out of it because I was too scared to, and my parents ended up talking to the school, and they didn't really do that much about it. But it's just little things. After 9/11, we had dirt in our mailboxes, like things that keep happening that, you kind of suppress a little bit, and then you get older and you realize, oh my gosh, so many of these things that happened were because of how I looked, and that people had this implicit bias even as a child towards me. Oh, I don't want to hang out with you, you're too dark. Oh, what are you? Things like that. So that's kind of what some of the smaller things that we experienced.
The thing I think of immediately is that I went to the South Shore Charter Public School in Norwell from kindergarten to my senior year. But in my sophomore year, I actually went to Scituate High School for 1 year, and I was appalled by the racism that existed among these children. Whether that's the language they use, whether that's who they hang out with, how they treat a lot of the children in the MECO program. And I went to the charter school, which was very diverse racially, economically, geographically. So it still existed there, but not to the same capacity as the homogenous town existed. And that really gave me insight as to just the absolute struggle that people of color and black people have to go through in these towns in their education. We are not creating safe environments for young children to grow and to develop and to feel confident in themselves. I can't imagine what it's like to be a person of color growing up in Hingham, Scituate, Norwell, Hanover, what have you. It's incredibly difficult. And I have a more specific story. I've been fishing in Scituate for my whole life since I was a young kid. Always had my license, always was responsible. You know, the one time I've had a police officer come to where I was fishing and stop us, it's when I was with my black friend who came down from Boston. The one time. I've been fishing there for over 10 years. And that was the one time. And that even though it relates to the police department, that's very telling to me how the South Shore deals with race, how they look at racism, how people are profiled, not just in police departments, but in education systems and financial institutions. In every walk of life, this racism permeates our society.
You know, we had a small group of Metco kids attending, and we had a small group of black people that lived in town that, you know, as we discussed the history of Tuttleville and stuff like that, and the families that grew up there. So, you know, I think my experience was that, like, when you're younger, it doesn't really seem to matter. You just treat each other as individuals. You don't really, you know, and it's sort of a shame hearing Rohini's story. And she was exactly right, that child probably was hearing that from an adult. I mean, Art Linkletter had a great series of amazing things as kids say. And kids just don't come up with these things on their own. So there's no doubt that some of these exist. And I think that it was sort of different as we progressed through school and you got into the older groups and the local groups of Hingham blacks and people of color mixed in with the Metco students. It started to change, and I think you became less associated with them, and it was sort of, there were some that just continued. But, you know, I think then there was some other groups that got involved more in the well, Black Lives Matter didn't exist back then, but there was still a lot of racial stuff going on in different movements. So you could see the progression, you know, as people get older, and I guess, and that probably shouldn't happen in reality. And that I know caused some division, but I go back listening to some old stories, and, you know, I like history as a sort of a thing that is interesting to me. And I've talked to people, when one of the first black families moved into Hingham and they moved onto Main Street, Hingham, you know, you hear people talk about that. Oh my God, there's a black family on Main Street in Hingham. Or the fact that, oh my God, they're going to build a temple on Main Street in Hingham. So, you know, we have this Yankee tradition, and yeah, that's incorporated into some of the feelings that people have here. So, and I think more recently, on a personal note, my daughter-in-law is from Guatemala, and we went to the Hingham landfill a couple years ago. And while I was doing my thing, she went over to the swap pile, and she was getting some toys for the kids that were, you know, my grandchildren. And someone asked her, like, what she was doing there. And, you know, we sort of joked about it, but then I got to thinking about it, and it's like, well, people go there all the time. Like, why did they ask her? Because she was from Guatemala and looked different, and maybe they were questioning it. And, you know, so it does, you know, I guess that's that subtle stuff that we talk about, that, and, you know, my son has moved to Pembroke, and in the back of my mind, I do say, like, geez, I hope the kids don't get teased, and I hope the kids will be okay. Those are the subtle things that I think that we need to talk about, and yeah, that's where racism builds. And I've always thought that it takes generations sometimes to get rid of emotions, and every generation that comes along is generally better than the one before us. My daughter is much better than she's much more open to everything, and I think it's just so slow. It's a slow changing process, and that's what worries me, that we're trying to do. It's going to take a while. It's not going to go away tomorrow. As I said a little bit, is that I'm always aware that police departments are always changing, and we need to stay forward looking, and we need to change as society changes. And as a result of the world around us, we see an upsurge of where we're directed. And I don't want to focus just so much on the Hingham Police Department. I think we try to do a good job. We don't have a lot of the issues that other areas have. We're pretty well trained. We have the ability to be trained. But I look around and I say, so many of these things that have happened, that obviously you don't have to be hit over the head, that we need to make changing in not only policing, but how we deal with the inequities in society, and why, I look at it as an issue. It's beyond just police departments. It's involved in the government making changes and how we develop inner cities and different programs. And we experienced a lack of government intervention in the opioid crisis, in the mental health crisis. And as a result, we've had to fill that gap. And we've made some, in my opinion, plenty of progress in that, to the point that I think at some point we should be having social workers or clinicians working for us. We currently have that through a grant. So there's lots of things that we can continue to do, and we can continue to improve. And I just really feel that the more people get to know what we do and why we do it, and having discussions like this enlighten everybody. And I think when we enlighten each other, I'm going to walk away with certain perspectives that I didn't have before. And I think that's so important. And, as a society and a leader of a law enforcement group, I understand my position and the sensitivity and how I can affect people's lives. And we have to sort of be on top of our game.
I think first and foremost, educating the population to these issues, having these conversations that we're having. But that's the first step. After that, we would be looking to enact policies at the town level, hopefully at the state level, and then at a countrywide level, at a national level, to better and enhance communities of color and Black people in this country and in our town and in our state. And it really ultimately means being an ally. And I think this is a marvelous opportunity for law enforcement to be an ally, for education officials to be an ally, for financial institutions to be an ally, for local government officials to be an ally. Just because you don't necessarily agree with Black Lives Matter as an organization is no excuse to not stand up to racism in this country, is no excuse to not be an ally to these issues. You may have your differences with Black Lives Matter, the organization, but now is the time to take a firm stance, to take a moment to be an ally to Black people in this country and people of color in this country. So I hope that we inspire some of that change through our chapter and through our movements.
I think something to remember when we're trying to be allies to this movement is just the term racist, right? Because I think that we throw it around and insinuate that someone is a bad person when we say racist, but we are all racist. We all have implicit bias, and we need to acknowledge that and understand why we have those biases and work to overcome that. So when someone is being called a racist or being called out on something that they might have done wrong, like, think about being accountable and teachable as you're just trying to be better and there for the people that are being marginalized. So if someone calls you out, take it as an act of love. That person wants you to be better, not for themselves, but for society as a whole. So I think something really important in this movement is to remember that we're all learning, and we all have to be accountable for our own personal actions, and just learn from that so we can better help the Black community.